a sense that China policy in Europe and the United States has found it a challenge at times to keep up with the tremendous changes and debates that are taking place in China, not least about the different political futures there that are being contemplated. And we hope that this China in Transition project and discussions like the one that we're about to have can help to close that gap. Now, GMF is a transatlantic institution, and the Asia program was founded not only because it was clearly going to be so important to think about how we adjust to changing global power dynamics and shifting balances in the region, but also because at the time the program was established, Europe and the United States faced serious differences over their views of China and of Asia as a whole. To help bridge some of those differences, GMF has put in place a series of sustained and intensive dialogues that take place not just transatlantically, but with some of our most important partners in Asia. We've been particularly pleased to collaborate with the Swedish government on a number of these, most notably the Stockholm China Forum and the India Forum, which a number of you in this room have taken part in. And we've been delighted more recently to be able to add the Tokyo Trilateral in partnership with the Tokyo Foundation, the Pakistan Trilateral, the Young Strategists Forum, the Global Swing States Project, and some new collaborations in South Korea, and Southeast Asia. It's been our sense over the course of these dialogues that from some of the early days of divisions between Europe and the United States, actually views on Asia have been converging quite significantly. And in the coming years, we're going to be working particularly closely on trying to translate that convergence into some more practical areas of cooperation, to try and put some flesh on the bone of the claim that the United States should be pivoting to Asia with Europe rather than away from Europe. Dan Twining and I will be around for the next couple of days to talk to any of you about these different initiatives. And we really look forward to including many more of you in the Asia program's work as we move forward. And with that, let me hand over to Philip Stevens, who will be chairing the first session.
As China experienced its once-in-a-decade handover of power last year, the debate about its economic, social, and political future took center stage both within the country and around the world. Is the Chinese Communist Party still able to adapt to social and economic forces emerging in the country? Are European and US policies well adapted to China's economic and political changes over the next decade?
Good morning. I'm Philip Stevens. I'm a columnist on the Financial Times. Some of you probably don't know that moderating at the Brussels Forum is it's a competitive business. First of all, people like me worry whether we're going to be asked, and then we worry who's going to get the best panel. Well, this morning we're talking about China, and as you can see, we have a stellar panel. So I'm claiming victory in the moderator's gold cup. This week, China got its new president. The Catholic Church got a new pope, and I've been struggling to see whether there are any parallels. Well, of course, the Pope is a Jesuit, the first Jesuit Pope, and of course it was the Jesuits who were the first Europeans to fully recognize the culture, creativity, and intellect of Chinese civilization. So that's one parallel. But the one I think that struck me was the question that both of these choices raised. As a Catholic, the question for me is this going to be a reforming pope? As a citizen of the world, the question for me about the new Chinese president, Xi Jinping, is this going to be a reforming president? Is this going to be a leader who takes China through the transition? And the thing that strikes me whenever I go to China is how, from the outside, we see this sort of linear progress, China's rise to, some people say, to a sort of global hegemon within the next 20 or 30 years. Whenever I'm in Beijing, speaking to Chinese officials, I think in terms of, I feel a greater insecurity and people talking about how can we manage this? Can we keep the economic show on the road? And can we meet the aspirations, the political aspirations of a rising Chinese middle class? And I'm going to start with some questions to the panel, and I'm going to start with a question to Vice Minister Ai Ping from the International Department of the Chinese Communist Party. We're very grateful that you've come for this session. I'm going to offer you a quotation from one of my colleagues in Beijing who wrote this week. He wrote, "There's not a scrap of evidence that Mr. Xi harbors a secret desire to radically overhaul the current Chinese system." And that, of course, is one big reason why he got the job in the first place. Now, Vice Minister, is this a fair reflection on the new president's ambition or lack of ambition?
Sorry, I did not quite catch what your colleague in Beijing said.
What he said was that he'd seen no evidence that the new president wanted to be a great reformer. And one of the reasons that the new president actually got the job was because his colleagues didn't want a reformer.
Well, maybe first part of his saying is somewhat correct, but I cannot agree with the second part. Well, it so happened that I know the new president in person. We were born in the same year, and some 40 years ago, we were sent to the countryside, and we went to the same county. I still remember days that we spent in that county. I came back to Beijing much earlier. I spent 4.5 years there, and he spent almost 7 years. So I think he became politically mature in that environment that I still remember very vividly. With that experience, with all the foreign jobs he has taken since at that time, he moved from the village level to the county level, to the prefectural level, to the provincial level. So all these decades now, he has seen so much in China, and I believe he has a strong desire to improve the life of the ordinary people. And that's why I believe that he's, maybe to use your term, a reformist. And I think one of his first action after he took over as the general secretary of the party was to tour the Shenzhen, the special economic zone that I believe you know very well. That was a strong signal that he will continue the reform. And in China, I believe an overwhelming majority of the people, including high-ranking officials in the party, believe reform is the only way out for China. So I don't know how come that your colleague arrived at the conclusion that many people didn't want any reform, and that's why he was given the job.
Well, I suppose just if I could come back, there's reform and there's reform. There's reform that is incremental change, making things a bit better here, or whatever. There's the reform that says a China with, a third of a trillion people with a billion people with in the middle class is going to need new structures, a more fundamental change. So I think the question is whether it's incremental change or whether there's a more radical vision.
Well, personally, I prefer more incremental change. In China, we believe that we suffered so much that we were too much in a hurry, and we wanted to have what we call a great leap forward, but the result was a great human sufferings.
Right.
We will not repeat that mistake, so we would rather to have a reform in incremental nature.
Okay, fine. I'm going to turn to Pan Wei, who's a professor of international studies at Beijing University, but has written writes eloquently both on domestic politics and international relations. And I think I'd like to talk to you about the domestic reform and politics. And you've written about this false dichotomy, I think you call it, between Western-style democracy and Chinese-style autocracy, or whatever you want to call it. But I think the question I have is for the rising middle class in China, is more prosperity going to be enough? Because I think the assumptions we have in the West is that as people get richer, they become more demanding of their political leaders and of their political system. That's not to say they necessarily want, our style of democracy, but they want more accountable government. They want more entrenched. They want the rule of law more greatly entrenched. How's China handling this, and how will the new leadership be different, if it will at all, from the last one?
I think that the new government is tilting towards more participation. As we can see that the new leader frequently mentions an old term called mass line. That is to draw more people to participate. And to somehow, my understanding is to restore the communitarian kind of a self-rule. So to give people more participation. However, I would say the general understanding is that middle class would be somewhat anti the establishment, but that's not true. Actually, the term called middle class is very Western. We say that the society must definitely divide it into upper, middle, and lower classes. And that doesn't apply very well to China. The newly prosperous people, I think they're the backbone of supporting this current establishment. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll call them the newly prosperous, but I'd just like to come back. If one looks at the blogs and the internet, one sees a very, as you say, vibrant set of political demands and forces. You also see a government that sometimes is trying to control it. I remember in January a conversation with a student in Beijing who said this seditious material goes up on these micro blogs and the censor will take it down within 5 minutes, but by that time it's been copied a dozen times and has gone around the system, and there's a sort of race that goes on between. Do you think is this a manifestation of a more participatory system that the Chinese authorities feel comfortable with? I get the impression they feel slightly worried about it.
Yes, but also they're not really discouraged. You can see that on this mobile internet, lots of opinions and particularly finding of the officials kind of unlawful behavior, and once they're discovered and quickly once they're discovered on the internet, quickly they're removed from their position. So it seems that the Communist Party and the government deems that as a positive thing in terms of their general campaign against the corruption.
Okay. I'm going to turn now to Professor Wang, Professor Wang Yizhou, who's also who's an associate dean, I think, at Beijing University, but also a scholar of Chinese politics and international relations. I'd like, if I can, to ask you about the external side. What we have seen in the last 2 or 3 years. In fact, since I think the Beijing Olympics, is a China, some would say more assertive, some would say more aggressive, but certainly a China more willing to make its voice heard on the international stage, and particularly in its own neighborhood. And we've seen an alarming, I think for some of us, rise in tensions, particularly in the East China Sea, between Japan and China, but also some clashes between China and the Philippines and Vietnam in the South China Sea. So I wonder, as China develops, and you've written about it's got to take on a new global role, but is its first objective to gain suzerainty over its own neighborhood? Does China want, I suppose, the 21st century equivalent of a Monroe Doctrine in East Asia?
I think to new leaders, to Xi Jinping and his fellows, 3 very urgent tasks regarding your question. First, how to balancing, on the one hand, domestic further needs of reform and international obligations, global governance, and more involvement to regional solutions. This is very challengeable because right now, majority Chinese still, including leaders, still inward looking. Domestic pressure is increasing, nationalism, corruption, and gaps among regions. So this is very urgent for leaders. But on the other hand, we see more and more international needs for China to play a larger role in the global regional participations. So the balancing is very test stone for new leaders, more than before. Second, I think, as you mentioned, it's very challengeable for leaders how to balancing the so-called the neighborhood policy, which set up by Deng Xiaoping in past 3 decades, is very workable, and the increasing needs for Chinese self as a sea power to take care more its maritime interest. So this is sometimes not necessarily is harmonious. Some conflicts you mentioned with some neighbor countries, actually we have 8 countries that disputes with China. So the balancing, very challengeable, as another test stone for leaders. Finally, I think the third one is global level, that China, how to cope with the United States, with European, with India, with other powers, world powers, to have a more creative involvement in global issues such as Iran issue, climate warming, refugees, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, persuades our European colleagues, American colleagues, Indian colleagues, to think, to agree that China's increase peacefully, prosperous, is not beneficial to China itself, but also it's very good for other parts, for you. So persuasion is also very important, though not very easy. This is also very important, urgent job for Xi Jinping, I think.
So China's going to be looking for more soft power, and we saw actually a report that Mr. Xi is going to be taking his spouse on, for the first Chinese leader for a long time to be taking his spouse on foreign trips as part of this soft power. But I think you made a very good sort of set of distinctions there between China and its neighborhood, China protecting the expansion of its global interests in terms of trade routes and whatever, and then China managing its great power relationships. And I hope we'll come back to those subjects. But the one thing I really would like to press you on was the dispute with Japan over the Senkaku or Diaoyu, depending which side of the channel you're looking on. To some of us, this looks really dangerous. That it's the sort of place where an accident can happen. You could have ships clashing, or Chinese aeroplanes which fly very close, and perhaps engaged with Japanese forces. And some of us at this particular time who are thinking, as Europeans, thinking of 1914, I heard someone say, is the Senkaku going to be the Sarajevo? Now that's perhaps sounds extraordinary, but it isn't. Isn't it very worrying, the danger of this clash?
No, actually, I'm not so worried. I don't want to tell historical stories about China's sovereignty claims. My attention is that right now, in my observation, international media, including European ones, pay more attention to so-called tensions or potential clashes, less notice about the both sides try to do something to do so-called crisis management, some efforts to communicate, to go further. Given the fact that currently the both sides have new leaders and new groups to be familiar all these kind of things. So I think in the medium and long run, I feel a little bit cautious, optimistic to have a soft landing. Last year, actually, President Xi Jinping have a very important speech with Japanese parliament man about how to do further both sides, so-called the crisis management. So this is a good signal.
Okay. Before moving on to Minxin, I just would like to ask the Vice Minister on this point. Are there arrangements in place between the Japanese and Chinese authorities so they can communicate quickly with each other if there are mistakes, misunderstandings, miscalculations made in the East China Sea? Is there a system, some of us remember the sort of Soviet-US system, where there are all sorts of guarantees or levels of communication which was to prevent escalation. Is there anything comparable between Japan and China?
I think now in a more globalizing world, we have a lot more channels compared with the old days of the Cold War, when, of course, there were direct telephone line between the heads of state. But nowadays, in addition to regular channels between, say, the two foreign ministries, embassies, this is a traditional type of channels, we have a lot more what maybe we can call public diplomacy. I can tell you that in my department, international department of CPC Central Committee, we maintain regular exchange programs with all the major political parties in Japan. And I think during the recent difficult time in our bilateral relations, these channels played a positive role. So I can assure you that channels are there for consultation and communication between two countries.
Thank you. I'm going to turn last but not least to Minxin, as Andrew said, is running the GMF's program this year, but he's a distinguished scholar, has been for many years, and professor in American academia. I wonder if I could ask you from the outside to try and put these two things together, as it were, the dynamic between the need for domestic reform, the need, and we haven't talked about this yet, I'm sure we will, to sustain economic growth at a high level and also accommodate political pressures at home, and the way that China behaves on the international stage and manages the relationships that Professor Wang talked about with other great powers. So I wonder if you can, sorry, it's a big ask, but if you could try and sort of put those two together a little.
3 quick points. Mr. Xi comes in into his office at a period when China faces very difficult external relations and domestic challenges. On the external front, his top priority is to reverse roughly 3 years of very antagonistic and competitive dynamics with the US and with the neighbors. The immediate cause of this downward spiral is China's territorial disputes. But the deeper driver of China's increasingly antagonistic relationship with the West is the lack of domestic political reform and the combination of overconfidence and deep seated insecurity on the part of its ruling elites. And for Mr. Xi, I'm sure common sense would dictate he will reverse this spiral of relationship, but he faces very difficult domestic reality. On the one hand, his need to present himself as a strong leader and his appeal to nationalism probably has painted him into some kind of a corner. And second, he has also made some declarations on China's core interests that will make compromise difficult. And so when you look his first choice of overseas destination, Moscow, it does not indicate to us that he wants to place the repair job at top of his agenda. On the domestic front, China has just come out of what might be called a decade of Brezhnev light. That is, a period 10 years of economic progress but political stagnation. So for Mr. Xi, he has three choices. Certainly he does not want to be another Brezhnev in China, but he has openly rejected the option of radical change, which you might call the Gorbachev solution. And the default position he has taken, and based on this very illuminating talk, private talk he gave to Chinese leaders, it indicates that he probably is set upon being China's version of Andropov. He will obviously demonstrate that for a late Soviet system, the Andropov solution is a viable one. And that brings me to the last point. I think we are now focusing too much on the small t transition. We are overlooking the big T, regime transition. If you put China in this whole universe of history, social science research, our understanding of late Soviet systems, this is a system that has its viability severely in doubt in the future, 10, 15-year time frame. The probability of some disorderly transition or some managed transition from the current system to another one is not just real, it is fairly high.
Okay, well, that's a rather bold prediction. I'm not sure Mr. Xi would like to be compared to Mr. Andropov, but I'm not going to ask any more questions because I'd like this to be, as much as possible, a conversation between everyone in the room. So I'm going to open it up. I'm going to take 2 or 3 comments, questions. If you could state your names and no speeches. I think the panelists have been brilliantly concise, so I think everyone who contributes from the floor. So who am I going to take first? I'll take this gentleman here.
Yeah, my name is Ono, from the Japanese Parliament. And thank you so much, Dr. Wang, the expectation of the new relationship between China and Japan under the new leadership. But unfortunately, I came from the old government. I was kicked out by the LDP, and I was a vice minister for defense at that time. And I'd like to raise a question to the honorary IPN, because you are the expert on the East Asia. And do you think as he mentioned, the hotline idea between the Japan and the China or whatever the neighbors will be seriously considered under the new leadership of China? And one more question was as of the Chinese role in the international societies after the new experiment of the North Korea. Is North Korea is asset for China for the your security, or is North Korea is a deficit for the China for your security and stability? Two questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This lady here. Sorry, this lady.
Hello, I'm Nina Dos Santos, an anchor at CNN. My question, I suppose, is probably best directed at the Chinese government representative. China is obviously one of the countries in the world with massive foreign currency reserves. It's effectively the biggest creditor to the United States. And if we keep hearing that the renminbi will eventually be fully integrated, will it be integrated within the next 10 years, and when will that relationship change? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And then this gentleman here, and then I'll come over to this side in a moment.
Andrew Kahn, I work with Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications company, and chair their advisory board in the UK. It strikes me that one of the misconceptions is that a company like Huawei is a danger, whereas actually it's the sort of China and Chinese development, Chinese company that needs to be encouraged because it wants to be global. But my question is this. What I observe when working with Huawei is that within China there's a huge preference given to the state-owned enterprises, but whereas the private sector is where the innovation comes, where the productivity comes, and where much of the economic growth comes, the government seems still to give huge privileges to the state sector. How do you think, will that change, and how might that change come about?
Okay. I'm just going to take one more here, actually. Sorry. And then we'll... sorry, Andrew. Yeah.
Thank you. Koji Tsuruoka, Deputy Foreign Minister from Japan. I just had the eye contact with the moderator and couldn't refuse to take the floor. But I'll be very brief. If I may, two very concrete questions. Annually, the tripartite summit has been taking place among the three countries, China, Japan, and Korea. The next scheduled meeting is in May. We're hoping that this will be the meeting of the three new leaders of the region and hopefully produce positive results for the region and also for the world. So my first question is whether there is expectation in the new Chinese leadership that this meeting will actually take place. The second question is in response to mentioning of the soft power, which is very important, and I applaud the presentation by our Chinese colleagues on these issues, one of which I think is rule of law. If we are to accept rule of law, the question is whether countries are prepared to go to International Court of Justice or international binding arbitration. Is there any preparedness in the new Chinese leadership to accept the mandatory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice? China, of course, has had its own judge on the bench always as a member of the permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Japan accept mandatory jurisdiction. I would hope that this rule of law will be the safeguard for any difficulties that we may have. Thank you.
Thank you. I counted 6 or 7 brilliant questions, and I was wondering why I hadn't asked any of them myself. So, but the hotline idea, the idea, I think the North Korea question, which we didn't mention, is very interesting. We had in my newspaper, a scholar from the Central Party School wrote a piece a few weeks ago saying it's time for China to dump North Korea and see the peninsula unified, which I thought was striking. But you do hear this. We have the question on are the troika, can we call them the troika, the triumvirate of new leaders in East Asia going to indeed meet in the early summer, as expected? Do we have, does the new Chinese government see the rule of law and binding arbitration as part of increasing its soft power? We had 2, I think, important economic questions. One from the Chinese private sector saying, when's the state going to get out of the way a bit, or at least rebalance the playing field, and the other on the renminbi and whether we're going to get full convertibility. I'm going to start with the Vice Minister, and then I'm going to sort of ask everyone to sort of chip in on the areas where you think that you can contribute. But I'll start with you, Vice Minister, because there were some quite specific questions to you.
Okay, maybe I should start with this incoming summit of the 3 countries. So far, I haven't heard anything that saying that China would propose to cancel this. So I would suppose that it's still on the agenda, and I believe there's a strong desire from all 3 sides to make them successful. As for a related question about hotline, as I mentioned just now, that now I believe that we in China would like to. We believe that sometimes we can be innovative. For example, in terms of public diplomacy, in China we have a strong point of what we call comprehensive foreign relations. That means, in addition to traditional government state-to-state diplomatic relations, we also have public diplomacy, people-to-people relations. For example, between China and the European countries, people-to-people exchange program is the 3rd pillar that would hopefully improve the mutual understanding between Chinese and the Europeans. For North Korea, well, I don't know why this scholar from the Central Party School wrote like that. I could only regard that as a sign of inner party democracy. So that means that, you can raise different type of view within the party. So even for a very important organ like the Central Party School can write differently. I think the fact remains that Korea is a neighbor of China. That fact you cannot change. And for that, I think our policy is still to help North Korea to develop, to improve its relations with international community. And although some people would believe maintain some kind of alliance between China and North Korea, we hope that in the long run we have a normal state-to-state relations as well as the party-to-party relations with them.
Professor Wang, just on North Korea, I mean, you do get these two, as the Vice Minister said, two views. One, we have to sustain the regime in North Korea, but two, this regime is as difficult with us as it is with the Americans, and indeed, there are some North Koreans who seem to have the same view of both China and the US in their enmity. How do you think things are moving there? Do you think it's the Chinese government will change its position?
Okay, I think two things is important to observe this issue. One is that in China's domestic backgrounds, there are increasing diversity on how to deal with these labors. This is fact. Mr. Aiping just mentioned, increasing pressure for leaders is more complicated to make decisions. But I want to emphasize another importance. From long run, China and the North Korea relation is in a transition from traditional blood ally relation to a new normal relation. Though it's gradual, incrementally, we already witnessed 2 decades, and I still think another long run is very needed. During the process, you have to be very careful to take care of such issues like nuclear issues, the conflicts between North and South, and also economic and so many other things. But for China, it's very important. The current, very urgent task is to make stability of peninsula. No refugee issues, no clash, no military conflicts. This is priority for China. But there are also very important to consult, to coordinating with Russia, with the United States, with South Korea and Japan. I think this is very, I feel optimistic to have a stable but incrementally changes of this traditional relation to a new relations.
Okay. Professor Pei, do you want to pick up at any or all of these questions?
Well, 2 questions, one about state-owned enterprises and the other about financial liberalization. There is no economic reason for state-owned enterprises to be given such privileges, but there are a lot of political reasons. The state-owned enterprises exist in China to such an extent in such a form because state-owned enterprises form the basis of a patronage system through which the ruling elites reward their followers, reward their families. If you take away their low-cost, no-cost access to capital, monopoly rights, the immediate question is, what are you going to do with roughly 10 million Communist Party members who are employed in senior positions, executive positions in their system? Because they cannot compete. And that's a political question. It's not an economic question. In terms of financial liberalization, China is caught in this huge dilemma because its domestic financial institutions are very poorly regulated. If you free up capital accounts, then you're going to create a very risky system. So they have to reform the domestic financial institutions first before they can go down the next step. But reforming that part of the system is hugely difficult technically, and also requires complementary political reforms as well. So we're talking about a long, long time.
Professor Pan, do you want to?
Yeah, as to the state enterprises, I would say, well, making a political charge is easy. But if you do the concrete analysis, you would find most of the state enterprises are in the infrastructure area, high-tech area, where China suffers a high-tech embargo, and in the military area, such as jet fighters. And for example, railroad, the high-speed rail, it's costly, and also in some areas that is in fierce competition with huge business tycoons like energy and raw materials. So that China forms the state enterprises, because China's enterprises are born to be family business, just like derived directly from the family farming. So it's very small, cannot bear this kind of high cost. That's why, not only from the Chinese government, but just getting from the foreign banks are very difficult for them as to the size of those Chinese enterprises. But as to the high-tech business, I would say, for example, solar. Solar energy actually attracted lots of government money to support, and now the government is facing the laws.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to just take. I'm not going to be able to get everyone. I'm going to get the gentleman there on the second row, and then the gentleman behind him, and then the lady here. Take that clutch of three. Yeah, I got this. I think we're going to run out of.
Hi. I'm a professor on international relations and strategic studies in Beijing, and I would like to ask the same question to our Vice Minister and Professor Pei, and then I will raise a question to my colleague in Beijing, Professor Wang. And the first question is that, according to my observation, Secretary General Xi Jinping, and since he took party power in 18th Party Congress, I found that the most consistent theme of his public statements up to now is the resurgence of China's national greatness. And probably already formalizes as some concept of China's dream. And so my question to our Vice Minister is, can you elaborate a little further according to your personal point of view, what is this, the idea of the resurgence of China's national greatness and China's dream? My question to Professor Pei is that, and what you reading and out of this kind of statement from your perspective? And my question to Professor Wang is that you just mentioned you have some prudent confidence of the soft landing for the planned extraordinary intensive Sino-Japanese confrontation over ice. So my question is how you define concretely in a diplomatic way the soft landing. And also, and if you look at past 6 months, you found the Chinese public opinion and opinion from some officials or even some generals. I think that there's opposition from this opinion force to accepting even welcome a hard landing. And so in this context of Chinese public opinion, what is your confidence for soft landing come from? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Just behind, if you could give the microphone to the gentleman behind.
Good morning. Nick Gowing, BBC World News. Vice Minister Ai, you talked about inner-party democracy. Can I pick up on that point? Because I'd like to ask a simple question about how much the party is now conflicted by social media. Social media, in many ways, in so many areas, in so many countries, is actually a new opportunity but many in power everywhere in the world see it as a threat. What is happening in the party schools to come to terms with this new reality, where more people are consuming Weibo and trusting it than the People's Daily and other institutions like that? Because is it a question of the party maintaining its supremacy of information? Or is there an acceptance now that there's a new empowerment at the bottom levels which is going to reveal inequities, pollution, social injustices, and that's what the party has to respond to and not see it as a threat?
Okay, thank you. The lady just in front, if you could just pass the microphone forward.
Thank you so much. Erika Mann, Facebook. Vice Minister, I do have one question which relates to Africa, because I think we are all seeing, the huge investment China is making in Africa. And the question is, which I do have, and I think many share, is this a sign of a geostrategic, relevance and importance, or is it just an economic investment? Or can we see this as a sign that China is getting more engaged in global world affairs?
I'm going to take two more because so many people want to interrupt. So the lady here and then the gentleman here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Dei Fortuna Anwar from Indonesia. And I'd like just to go back to Dr. Pan Wei's and about the social transformation in China and its possible political impacts. You mentioned about the new prosperous Chinese being different from middle class from other countries. Somehow they are much more contented and pro-establishment. Once upon a time, in fact not long ago, there used to be what were called Asian values, that somehow Asians are not really interested in democracy, that we Asians are more interested in stability and prosperity. Muslim societies are considered very conservative, better to have 100 years of tyranny rather than one day of anarchy, and so on and so forth. But we know that even in Southeast Asia, Indonesia went through a very tumultuous change, and you know that we are now the world's third largest democracy. In the Middle East, you have the Arab Spring. So what is it, a secret about Chinese society that somehow they are contented and will not challenge the current political order? Thank you.
Okay. And the gentleman just here, and then I'm going to wrap up this group, and then we'll do another one, I hope. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Marcos Freitas from Brazil. Professor Minxin, Dr. Minxin. The issue of corruption in China and a policy of transparency, would it make it Xi Jinping more like Andropov or Gorbachev if he were to address that?
Okay, now we've got a whole raft of questions there which run from the new president's emphasis on national greatness to questions about whether there'll be an economic soft landing and how you define that, to the role of social media both at home but also in the world, to Asian values and Chinese exceptionalism, and to this idea that we heard where does, well, a particular question from Minxin Pei, where does he sit in this Andropov-Gorbachev spectrum? So why don't we just, again, I'll start with the Vice Minister, but perhaps choose one or two of those, and I'll ask all of you to choose one or two of those.
Okay, I answer Professor Shi's question about General Secretary Xi Jinping's term of Chinese dream. My personal understanding. Actually, before coming to Brussels, I was participating in the CPPCC annual conference, this Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. There, actually, I was interviewed by Chinese media, and they asked the same question, how I myself personally would look into this, General Secretary's he's talk about rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Personally, I said that for me, since I have been engaged in promoting international understanding on behalf of the Communist Party of China, I would like to see more the international aspect of China, the dream of China. I think that some 30 years ago, CPC decided to launch the reform and opening policy, because at that time we came to realize that our understanding of the national conditions in the country was not exactly correct. We were, before that, following a so-called continuing revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat. So as other countries busy modernizing themselves, we were engaged in class struggle. And then we made some fundamental change. The focus of the attention of the party and the state moved to the economic development. So now I think as China grows, now there's a very urgent task for us to understand not only the national conditions, but the global conditions, so that we should have a better understanding of the process of globalization, so that along with our growth, other people would benefit from this. Like the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, used to say that he hopes that the wind of Chinese growth would blow the sail of Russia, so that the country would accelerate its development. So I think nowadays we need a joint effort, both the Chinese and the international, so that we understand this globalization in a better way, so that we cooperate, and then more people would benefit from this so-called power shift. China, now we believe that we will. We're not, we use the term rejuvenation. That means we are proud of our ancient civilization. But for certain reasons, we lagged behind. We missed the opportunity of industrialization. Now we should catch up, learn the strong points of all the others, so that we can make our contribution. Of course, we need energies and raw materials, all the commodities. But at the same time, we believe that our growth also helps our friends in Africa. We need a growing amount of the commodities, and that also helps the price to rise. So we can see that with a continued, if we can avoid a hard landing, many people in this world would benefit. Okay. Maybe I should stop here.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Professor Pan, do you want to?
Okay. The political system in the world is quite often considered only two things, autocracy and democracy. But if you look at the whole world for the 195 countries, and you would find more than two things. Right? And some countries are successful countries, some are failed states. And not very long ago, Indonesia was considered as a failed state. And then today we see it's one of the next countries, one of the successful countries. But also there is a big problem as to bring the corruption under control. Okay. And actually for me, the more important thing is about good governance. Orderly and good governance means also at least that people on the streets would not be robbed. Okay, so people have a kind of a social solidarity consensus, and also clean water, and housing, work, jobs, and so on. I think that means good governance. So in that case, I would encourage you to get out of this kind of a dichotomous, abstract concepts of autocracy and democracy. There are more than that. Thank you.
Professor Wang, I just wanted to add a question, if I can, to the list, because I'm struck that in this conversation, no one's mentioned the China-US relationship, which seems to some of us probably to be the most important for the sort of security of the world in the next. So do, if you, in the questions that were asked, do take, but I just wondered if you would add to your comment something on, how do you see the new president addressing the US administration and the extent to which there will be more engagement or less engagement than before.
Yeah, sure. First, about Sino-US relation, I think as our leaders and scholars emphasize very much, this is most crucial bilateral relations among all other relations in China's foreign policy, past, today, and future. And I guess for new leaders, they will continue this very priority to pay attention to Sino-US so-called gradual, stable, mutually beneficial relations. Xi Jinping even used the term, the new pattern of the power relationship. So I have some good prediction about that. About relation, about the definition of soft landing, as well as two Japanese friends' question. I want to say what I mean, the soft landing, there are two faults. One is that the success start of new round of negotiations between two foreign military bureaus. I have some confidence that Ambassador Wang, now the new foreign minister in China, and Japanese counterparts may have some engagement in the future about these issues. But another more further meaning to my term, soft landing, is that China's increasing import in overseas, in maritime, in coast area imports will accepted by our neighbor countries, including Japan, without much hurt, so-called the good neighbor policies. If we see the long run, these pictures be success promoted, that would be the soft landing.
Minxin, there was a particular question for you on your analogy with Andropov, but also I wonder if you could address the Sino-American relationship question as well.
The easy one first, that is corruption. Of course, the joke in China is, I don't know, the authorship keeps changing. It now goes back to Chiang Kai-shek. This sentence of wisdom purportedly says, if you allow corruption unchecked, the country will be destroyed. But if you fight corruption, the party will be destroyed. Of course, it used to be KMT, now it's a different party. Mr. Xi can fight corruption, but only to a limited extent. Because based on scholarship that has done across the world on fighting corruption, the most successful, effective tools are open media, NGO monitoring, and independent legal system. But suppose this is a package of cure, and you present this to the ruling Communist Party, which is political monopoly, it will ask this very question, is the cure worse than the disease? So I just leave it at that. US-China relationship. I live in the US, I'm Chinese-American. I sense, as I said at the very beginning, deep-seated strategic rivalry driven by several factors. What are these factors? China's military modernization, on the part of China's ruling elites, and on the part of the American establishment, political establishment, fundamental political distrust based on the chasm between the two political systems, and China's territorial claims, and the disruption of the balance of power in East Asia. So you have to stop these drivers from getting worse in order to look at the big picture of Sino-US relationship. I'm glad to hear that China's new leader has put US-China relationship on the top of his agenda, but I do not know what he's going to do to deal with the causes of the problem. There's not much he can do if he merely addresses the symptom of superficial tensions.
But there's two sides to a relationship, and I get the impression looking at US policy, which is said to be engage and hedge. I see quite a lot of hedging going on. I don't see the substance between or behind US engagement.
Well, I think we can debate about the balance of the so-called US pivot, whether it is too heavily militarized and not accompanied by diplomatic reassurances. But based on where I am, I would say that this too much hedging comes from a period of not very fruitful engagement. That is, the US government, the initial period they were heavily into engagement, but did not produce as much as they would like.
Okay, thanks. I'm told we've got 6 minutes, and then a hole opens here, and I fall into it. So there's a gentleman here. There was someone here. There was someone over here, and then I'm going to take these two, and that's it, I'm afraid.
I'm Professor Mohapatra from India. During 10 years of Hu Jintao government, China had tremendous amount of gain in terms of soft power in the neighborhood. Japan, South Korea, India, Vietnam all became the number one, China became the number one trade partner of all these countries. Now, do you think that now that China appears to be more assertive vis-a-vis Japan, Philippines, Vietnam, to some extent India, it is fast losing its soft power? Number two, how do you look at Indo-US defense and security cooperation from the Chinese perspective?
Okay, fine. This lady here and then the gentleman behind.
Thank you, Hennika Bochniarz, Poland. Wherever you go in China on a sightseeing tour, besides international tourists, you can see two groups. People from the countryside, 90% dominated by the old women, and then the kids' schools, 90% boys. So definitely there's a demographic bomb ticking behind that. Is the new leadership able to address this issue?
Okay, fine. And then the gentleman behind, and then I'm very sorry, but I'm going to have to wrap. Oh, all right, I'll take the lady at the back as well, and then I'm going to wrap it up, yeah.
Former defense minister from Austria. My question is, what kind of development and what kind of role do you expect for EU on the global stage in the next 2 decades?
Okay, thank you. And the lady right at the back there, and then this is it.
A question in the same line, because we are...
Could you introduce yourself, sir?
Maria Rodriguez, advisor in the European Union bodies and working with China since the starting of the strategic partnership. So my question is, how can we assess the state of affairs of the strategic partnership between China and the European Union?
Okay, I'm afraid you've got a minute each, and I'm just going to start. Richard Pay, we'll just go along this way. So mention if you choose one or two of those.
Demography.
The EU, demography.
Demography, yeah. I think probably it's too late to reverse the demographic decline of China. But the good news coming out of Beijing last week, or this week, was the abolition of the Family Planning Commission, which highly suggests a significant relaxation of the one-child policy. To some extent, of course, that's good news, but it's not going to make a huge difference. Certainly, it's not going to make a difference in terms of gender imbalances.
Thank you. Vice Minister.
Well,
perhaps on EU and
EU.
also and US and Indo-US and.
Yeah.
All in 60 seconds.
Well, I have many good friends in India. I would say that both the present ambassador and the previous ambassador to China, we cooperated a lot. And I believe that actually there's a great potential for two countries to cooperate. And recently I discussed with the present ambassador, perhaps we should extend this cooperation to other countries in the region. For example, trilateral cooperation to develop hydropower potential in Nepal. That would satisfy the need of all these countries. Well, for EU, I think just now I met Madame Ashton, and we said we are satisfied with the cooperation so far. You know, this 10th anniversary of the comprehensive strategic partnership. And we believe that after the 18th National Congress of CPC and this 12th National People's Congress, which transfer the general program into concrete policies, we would have plenty of we would have every reason to be optimistic about future cooperation between China and Europe.
Okay, thank you. Professor Wang, do we Europeans matter at all, or can we do anything?
A very quick response to this question. I think both sides, EU and China, have a big rooms to do further, to strengthen the relations. I think China's side, for instance, we should consider how to supply more public goods regionally and globally coordination with EU, such as global warming, new round of trade negotiation, and the Africa issue, so on and so forth. On the other hand, I emphasize that EU's importance to consider how to enhance its strategic views on China. Right now, many Chinese still think that the EU side only think China as an economic giant, a partner, or beneficial cooperation, not consider whether China as a political power and a security contributor to do more things. I think in both sides to consider how to do more strategic long-term design is very crucial.
Okay, thank you. And Professor Pan.
Okay, I think number one, the demographic issue is somewhat exaggerated. That actually the baby girl were not killed, they were just not registered, and now we see them now. And another issue is that about China's foreign relationship. I think many would say this is a communist country, it's one-party state, it's this and that. But actually for me, I would like to provide a new angle to see things. Chinese are the most materialistic people on earth. And we are talking about a people, a materialistic people dealing with a people of spirituality and people of semi-material, semi-spiritual people. So lots of problems can be accounted for by this. Thanks.
Okay. I'd like to say thank you to all the panelists who far exceeded my advanced billing. I mentioned I was wondering about the future of the church and the future of China, the Catholic Church. I now know a lot about the future of China. I'm not so much about the church. So thank you very much indeed.